Ciao Larry, grazie di essere qua con noi a fare una chiacchierata. Inizio subito con una domanda per te. Tu hai iniziato a fotografare da giovanissimo, ho letto interviste in cui si parla addirittura di 12-13 anni. Come mai ti sei avvicinato a questo linguaggio? Cosa ti ha attratto della fotografia?
Well, at first it was a hobby like any young boy would have. At second, it was beyond that because I was um, a complicated youth and didn't hang around in crowds or with the regular forms of social expression. So the camera was enabled me to have a kind of a dialogue back and forth with reality, whatever that means in its largest sense, so that I could somehow or another process the reality in front of me, see it in pictures, analyze it, feel it, reclaim it, and so on and so forth. So the whole principle of my whole existence, even to this day when I'm 80 years old, is the inner and the outer relationship to perception. First emotional, second intellectual in terms of how the emotion can be expressed, and photographically very, very important in terms of clarifying and stopping history and giving the photograph in itself its own little history, a story to be told and to be held. I think at the age of 12 or 13 or 14, I wasn't thinking about those things. As a matter of fact, quite not at all. But in retrospect, that's exactly what was going on. It was the inner and the outer world of my perceptions in my life, which was starting to become channeled photographically, and thankfully so.
E a un certo punto hai conosciuto Lisette Model e hai iniziato a frequentare i suoi corsi. Mi racconti come è successo questo incontro e come è avvenuto?
Here, let's be clear. I never took classes with Lisette. I studied with her privately. And the way that I got to see her and to meet her, because I didn't know about her previous before, because I was just floating around in an unformed existence. But I was like any gun, I didn't go to college, so I was in New York trying to make a living, trying to get a job, so on and so forth, as a photographic assistant, which I was not trained to do, nor was I prescribed to do, because the discipline system that I had in me was very, very renegade and not at all applicable for working for somebody else. I was a spoiled child in many respects, but so on. But I started to work for a chap named Raymond Jacobs, who was a very, very good photographer who studied with Lisette, but that I didn't know. But he had a big studio on 18th Street, and I showed up for work and lasted for about 3 to 4 days. And in my haphazard, chaotic kind of way, try to do what he asked me to do, but clearly I failed. And he fired me, but he liked me. He thought I was a seed of his own growth, of his own plant. He wanted me to be introduced to Lisette, and that's how it all started. So Raymond Jacobs, who stopped photography and became the chap who introduced earth shoes, Bergenstocks, into America and made himself a small fortune while taking care of people's feet. I don't think he washed their feet, but he took care of them. And so Lisette and I started with Ray Jacobs, and I thank you, Ray. And then we went on, and it was always a private lesson at her studio for the most part on 7th Avenue, which I wrote about in my little blurb, which is possibly on the wall or what have you. So that's how it started. I never had an experience of being in class with her.
E come funzionavano queste lezioni? Andavate in giro insieme a fotografare oppure parlavate di altri autori. Ho letto anche che in questo periodo tu in realtà preferivi andare ai concerti di musica jazz piuttosto che frequentare altri fotografi, quindi credo fosse una passione in comune con lei.
I was very, very involved with Henri Cartier-Bresson at that point in my history. And we talked a lot about Bresson and about Brezai and so on. We did a slight amount over the years, and we studied together. I studied with her for 2 years, 3, back and forth here and there. Sometimes she would come to Long Island to my parents' house where I was living too. And we would work in my darkroom, and then we would also work in her darkroom in the city, but it wasn't a very, very highly technical course. Lisette, even though she knew her stuff, was not involved with technique per se, only insofar that it could allow you to express what it was that was secret about you, or about that you wanted to share, or that was hidden within you, or that wasn't hidden and you didn't have the means in order to express it. Technique was that. Technique was language. But the actual teaching, if you will, was not about technique. It was about something deeper than that, which was about empathy, which is about the sensibility of what it means to be human, the sensibility of what kind of questions that we ask of each other as we go along in our lives trying to find some kind of identity. It's really interesting. I have this picture book here
Oh, wow.
with this fabulous picture. Can you see it?
Yes?
Yeah,
Yes,
well,
perfect.
anybody can look like anybody else anytime. We are each other. So the idea is not to place judgment upon another's soul, but to look at the entirety of their existence within that moment and then make a picture which is whole. Am I married to her?
Yeah. Yes, you may.
I better comb my hair.
Nelle fotografie, infatti, che sia quelle che ci hai fatto appena vedere di model, ma anche nelle tue, in realtà, sembri davvero entrare nella scena che ritrai e chi guarda le tue fotografie sembra poter essere parte di quella situazione, quindi c'è davvero un senso di empatia che tu riesci a trasmettere. Mi piace perché ho trovato sul tuo sito che c'è scritto che fotografare visceralmente fa parte della tua poetica. Questo credo fosse anche un consiglio che lei dava ai suoi studenti, giusto? Come oltre a queste cose qua che dicevi adesso, per cui aiutava voi a sviluppare proprio un vostro senso nei confronti dei soggetti che fotografate e che fotografavate, come vi aiutava a sviluppare una vostra poetica che fosse vostra davvero?
The idea of a photograph being a poem is a similar idea of a photograph being a short story. Is not a similar idea of a photograph being a novel, because a novel is elongated with serious definitions of plot and building of character and so on. In a poem or a short story, which has a very, very telescoped sensibility about the energy that you're actually dealing with, is more like a photograph. A photograph is just a lucky snap, or a learned snap, or a learned and lucky snap in the midst of a whole congestion, a coagulation of realities that have come together in an instant of time, like the description that Cartier-Bresson gives it, the decisive moment. it's basically all of those coincidences coming together are based on one coincidence, which is your own emotional and intellectual perception of what it is, what is the meaning out in front of you. A photograph is only an attempt at trying to clarify that meaning and to give the frame as much information or as little information, may the case be, as one can, so as to bring what it is that you were concerned about and moved by to the audience. Photography is an act of generosity. People sometimes say, no, 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 it's careerist and exploitation and so on and so forth. And that's absolutely true. It is, and it can be. But when it's used in its deeper sense, everything that we do as human beings can either be perceived as selfish and self-involved or in generous and other involved. You make the choice in your own life about how you want to live.
Larry, in realtà ti devo fare una confessione. Quando prima mi stavi facendo una foto, avrei voluto farti una linguaccia, però mi sembrava un po' irrispettoso nei tuoi confronti. Adesso mi parli della fotografia come generosità, mi sto pentendo di non averla fatta.
I wouldn't do that to you. Unless you were licking an ice cream cone or something like that, you know, but...
Torniamo seri per un attimo almeno, non troppo. Un'ultima cosa che ti volevo chiedere prima di rubarti altro tempo. Stiamo parlando del tuo percorso, di come la vicinanza anche con Lisette Model abbia modificato la tua strada in un qualche modo. Hai voglia di raccontarci un aneddoto legato alla vostra conoscenza?
Well, at first, since I was young and she was older and she was wise and I was not, she was my teacher, pure and simple. And by the way, we did from time to time go around the city and photograph, mostly the Lower East Side, because her idea about storefronts was very interesting, that everything that was in the storefront window was the presentation of a person's soul of a sort. And I remember dolls and some pictures that I took on our little expositions. The relationship was, after a while, a year or so, became rather intimate, certainly not in a personal sexual way, but intimate in the sense that I knew more about her and she knew more about me. And she was fascinated with my mother, who was a bourgeois woman, but very much a communist, an organizer and fearless. And she used to come out to Long Island and hang around with my mom and so on. So lots of things were known. Now, Lisette liked to be listened to because she had a lot of things to say. She liked to be respected. And there's one thing about me, which I hope is true, is that I'm a good listener. So when I would come to New York and I know there was a party or some kind of gathering or something like that, I would come to it not necessarily expecting to see Lisette, but knowing full well that she might be there. And if she was there, she would immediately ask for me to come over to her so that she could talk with me and that I would listen to her. I don't think that I don't remember that much speaking to her from my own point of wisdom, since there was little. But her wisdom was profound, and all I could do was listen and to learn. So when you ask me about how did my path change? My path changed profoundly from Lisette's teaching, but her teaching was not teaching after all. It was the process of living a life through the deepest point of its fascination and its curiosity.
Ora anche tu hai accumulato quell'esperienza e soprattutto tanti anni di insegnamento alle spalle, come lei, d'altra parte. Quindi mi chiedo cosa significa per te adesso, o cosa ha significato nel tempo insegnare fotografia e cosa avresti voluto che i tuoi studenti imparassero da te?
What is something that has always asked from my students? Well, first, of course, in the simplest way, to be honest. And the second would be passionate. And the third would be to be curious. And the fourth would be to use your imagination in ways which are sometimes not even appropriate. Because the imagination really is, if you think of it, a sliding sea. You can start with a fountain pen and end up with a fountain. You can start with a hammer and end up with a nail. You can start with a nose and end up with a throat. But it's just a question of how you can start with the flutter of an eye and think about a cloudburst. It's a question of associations. So when you look at the realities, and by the way, my realities oftentimes are very political in their orchestration because I had been the son of my mother and reasonably speaking, a trained Marxist, which I still am, but I'm not a Marxist anymore because of the flaw in the human species doesn't allow theoretical idealism and utopic thought to actually exist. But we try to make a better place for the world. The imagination is about hope. The imagination is about courage. It's that courage and hope and the imagination which I've taught for all my life. What I tried to do was to give young people, or older people for that matter, the courage of their own imagination and the hope that what that imagination would deliver would be a promise for all of us to experience and perceive.
Forse è per questo che hai fotografato tante volte diverse manifestazioni, penso a una delle ultime, quella delle proteste femminili per il movimento Me Too. Forse anche in queste manifestazioni trovi quell'immaginazione che cerca di cambiare il mondo.
The more emphasis you can put on the rights of everybody, women, men, elephants, the better it is for the world. Whether or not, I suspect that anything that you do in life which entertains the thought of being moral and being decent and being good and being generous to other people without being a pushover yourself, in the sense of being exploited or explored in ways which are negative to your own being, that everything you do in your own singular life actually adds to the collective life of all of us. I agree. My relationship to women, it should be said, has been that my origins have been only strong women. My mother was a strong woman. My sister, unfortunately now dead, was a strong left-wing lawyer. My wife, Martha Posner, one of the terrific artists, is a great and powerful woman. My former wife, Joni Snyder, one of the great American painters, was a powerful and still is a powerful woman. Pia Staniek, my second wife, who lives in Munich and is a shiatsu master, is a powerful and terribly dear woman. All of these people I maintain relationships with. because I love them. There's no reason not to love them forever. That doesn't mean you'll be with them forever. But it's important to understand that women's rights are human rights, and anybody who denies the rights to others is essentially depriving themselves of their own deeper human right. So when you subjugate somebody underneath your thumb, you become the subjugated one, because your humanity is imperiled by the fact of your hostility, your sterility, and your fear.
Larry, io ti ringrazio per questa bella chiacchierata, ti ringrazio anche per il bellissimo testo che hai scritto per il catalogo della mostra di Lisette Model, sperando che tu possa, forse, non credo, venire a vederla, ma che comunque potremo vederci presto dal vivo.
Thank you. And I have to say that I haven't seen you off camera. I've certainly seen you and then Christina. And what a pleasure it is to see you.
Thank you.
Just a pleasure, because the depth and the sweetness and the intelligence of your humanity is constantly fascinating to me. And I'm just looking at you like you were the guiding light.
Thank you.
Yeah.